This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Richard Fulmer. Richard is an engineer and systems analyst, the co-author of Energy, the Master Resource, and author of numerous articles on free market economics. He wrote a recent piece for the Mises Institute entitled Karl Marx's Missing Link, Erasing the Line Between Mercantilism and Capitalism, where he explores how Marx wrongly conflates the results of mercantilism with capitalism and what it means for economic analysis today. We will be discussing this piece on the show today. Richard, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to have you on. As I was telling you before the show, this is the 200th episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I cannot believe that I've been doing this for that long. And so just at the top, I just want to say thanks to all of my listeners for hanging in there with me. If you're a new listener, I really appreciate you guys joining the show. This is like a kind of a classic episode of the show because I love, every now and then we do some current events kind of topics on the show. And this obviously has a lot to do with Trump administration's recent tariff proposals and things of that nature. But I think this is going to be evergreen too. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about on the show today is just information about economics that everyone needs to be familiar with, regardless of what's going on in the political realm. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about this today. But before we get into the interview and your article, just tell us about yourself, your background, your work, how you got interested in economics, all of those things.
Okay, well, I grew up in the mountains of New Mexico in a mining camp near the Gila Forest. My dad was a mining engineer. I went to New Mexico State and got a degree in mechanical engineering. Started work with a railway equipment company in Oklahoma, and then ended up in the oil field. And I was designing a looped water injection system, and I needed a computer program to help me size the pipeline. And so I called up to the engineering applications group and asked if they had a program that would help, and they sent out the card deck. In those days, everything was punch cards. And it didn't do everything I wanted, so I made a few changes. And to the engineers I worked with, that was magic, being able to program a computer. And so the next thing I knew, I was in Houston in the engineering applications group. And they lent me on a temporary 3-year assignment to the IT group. And 30 years later, I retired from there. So anyway, being a mechanical engineer, I like to know how things work. And to me, economics is kind of how the world works. And so I get interested in economics. One way to learn something is to learn how it fails. And so I read a lot about the Soviet Union and a lot of the failures of central planning. And so I get interested in that. Somewhere along the line, I started writing about economics, and I've got a bunch of articles published and the book. But recently I got into a discussion online with a bunch of self-proclaimed Marxists, a few of whom actually knew something about Marxism. Most didn't. Most of my comments rated just a laughing smiley face icon. But from each according to his ability.
Right.
And but every now and then somebody asked a good question or made a really good point, and it got me scrambling, and so I had to do some research to answer them, and the result was half a dozen articles, one of which you read, and I think another one's going to be published tomorrow, and then yet another in next week. So anyway, here we are.
So I want to ask you about this article. It's very timely in the sense that, as I said at the top of the show, Donald Trump, his administration, within the last couple of weeks, has launched these tariffs, which he was proposing during his campaign. He suspended several of them, but we're still levying tariffs against China. So in that sense, this is a very relevant topic. But then in another sense, this is a very timeless topic because we're dealing with what appears to be a genuine contradiction in Marxist philosophy. So what motivated you to write this particular article at this particular time on this subject?
Well, again, it was just the discussion I had gotten with the Marxists online, and it occurred to me that a lot of their attacks were levied at not capitalism, but mercantilism. So a lot of attacks on colonialism, imperialism, and all of which Adam Smith had rejected in The Wealth of Nations and explicitly rejected. And so that got me thinking that in Marx's hierarchy of societies, he had left out mercantilism, the link from feudalism to capitalism. And it struck me that he had done that on purpose, so that he could conflate the two, mercantilism and capitalism, and then accuse capitalism of all the sins of mercantilism. And it's not like Marx was unaware of the difference between the two, because he quoted Smith extensively in The Wealth of Nations, and so he must have known that The Wealth of Nations was really a long polemic against mercantilism. In those days they would have called the mercantile system, and yet he didn't mention it at all. And I thought that was an awfully convenient omission, and it allowed him and his followers, even up to today, to blame capitalism for what mercantilists did.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be important before we get into the specific differences between capitalism and mercantilism, and they are very fundamentally different economic systems, maybe to step back and take a look at Karl Marx's system as a whole. And this is something that, I mean, not only people on the left who have never read Karl Marx, but a lot of like libertarians and conservatives have also not ever seriously engaged with Marx's work. And so they don't have any sort of general understanding of his theory of historical and economic development. So it might be helpful before we get into the specifics, just explain to my audience exactly what Karl Marx's overall theory was trying to get at.
Well, Marx argued that societies progress through a series of stages. So from primitive tribal communism to slave societies, then feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and ultimately communism. Now, communism was the ultimate, beyond which nothing better could be conceived. So that would represent the end of history. So according to his theory of historical materialism, the society's culture, its politics, laws, and ideology, what Marx called its superstructure, was shaped by its economic base. And the economic base meant basically the means of production, how it's organized, and who owns it, who controls it. So a class hierarchy emerges from this base, and it usually divides society into those who own the means of production and everybody else. Now, of course, as societies grow more complex, this hierarchy develops additional layers, and these class differences lead to tensions. And those tensions are increased as new productive forces emerge, and these forces come into conflict with the existing economic and social structures. So the conflict gives rise to class struggle. And of course, the dominant classes rarely give up their power willingly, and so revolutions are needed to advance society to the next stage. So in Marx's view, history is driven by class struggle and revolution. Now, there's some problems with this model. So first, the idea that economic structures shape social institutions applies, reasonably well to the early stages, to tribal communism and slave societies. But it starts to break down with feudalism. So, for example, feudal England and feudal Japan were really different. And yet, if the superstructure is defined or dictated, if you will, by the economic base, by the means of production, then they should have been pretty similar, and yet they weren't. And then the model really breaks down with capitalism. So here we see causation sometimes run in reverse. So instead of the base defining the superstructure, sometimes the superstructure changes the base. For example, elements of the superstructure, such as music, film, theater, have become their own industries. So instead of being shaped by the economic base, these cultural forms created new markets, new technologies, new labor systems. So in effect, reshaping the base itself. Next, Marx reduced history to class struggle and revolution. And that's a huge simplification. Geography played a huge role, as Thomas Sowell pointed out in his trilogy, Culture and Trilogy, and Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel. But technological innovation, I'm a mechanical engineer, so I think in those terms. But think of the role the printing press played in the scientific revolution, the discovery of antibiotics, inoculations for smallpox, uh, the invention of the telephone, car, airplane. All those had huge impacts on history, and none of them were driven by class struggle or by revolution. So, trying to tie complex phenomenon to a single cause is usually far more misleading than it is helpful. So another flaw in his theory is his assumption that the transition from socialism to communism would be peaceful and natural. But if socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat, why would those dictators be any more willing to give up their power than any other dictators? And he kind of waved at that issue, just kind of made the assumption without really explaining it. And then there was his claim that socialism and communism represent advances over capitalism. That's a claim that's yet to be demonstrated. Attempts to build Marxist societies usually led to regression to pre-capitalist stages. Okay, so hunter-gatherer, right, the earliest stage. We saw that with Stalin's terror famine in Ukraine, Mao's Great Leap Forward, and repeatedly in North Korea. Slave system. So we saw the Gulag in the Soviet Union, China's labor camps. Feudalism, so there was subsistence farming in Pol Pot's Cambodia. We saw peasants tied to collective farms in the Soviet Union and Mao's China. And, on China, it was Mao's death and the gradual easing of the internal passport travel restrictions that really led to a huge increase in Chinese GDP, because you had literally tens of millions of peasants misallocated to working on these collective farms. And then all of a sudden they were able to move to cities where there was better infrastructure, a lot of capital equipment. And so their productivity increased enormously. And so you had a huge jump in GDP, but that big jump was a one-time thing. You can free the peasants only once.
Right.
So none of the Marxist experiments were improvements over the capitalist West. Now there have been successful social democracies, the Scandinavian countries that are often cited, but they're capitalist economies. They've got they support big social safety nets, but it's capitalism is the engine. And I always find it odd when I hear socialists say, well, capitalism is exploitive and it's unfair and it's going to eventually collapse and we've got to get rid of it. So then you ask them what their solution is, and their solution is, oh, well, capitalism with this social safety net on top. So we got to get rid of capitalism when we're going to replace it with capitalism.
Yeah.
So the final flaw, and the one that my article was based on, was the fact that he conveniently omitted mercantilism from his list of historical stages. So the missing link between feudalism and capitalism, and it's a really important link. It shouldn't be glossed over, but he did it because, of course, his goal of Das Kapital was to beat up capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect setup for, I think, what's the most fundamental insight in your article. And this is the difference between mercantilism and capitalism. And as I said before, this is my 200th episode of the show. And I remember, like, all the way back on episode 3 as the first episode I ever did, where I talked about how important it was to define our economic terms. And I actually gave my audience a fundamental definition of capitalism, which people on both the left and the right in the United States, they throw around terms like socialism and capitalism, and they have no idea what they actually mean. There's no concrete definition. And so mercantilism is kind of the same way. So walk us through this here. What exactly is mercantilism? And then what exactly is capitalism? And how do these two concepts differ from each other?
Okay, well, as I've been preparing for the podcast, I've been thinking about it. And the textbook definition of mercantilism is okay, but to me, it's really feudalism scaled up to a national and an international scale. So let's go back to feudalism. Let's say that you're the baron. You've got your castle and you've got your lands around you, and you've basically got a contract with your peasants. You're going to protect them, and they're going to provide you with food and labor. Well, to protect them, you need an army. Maybe not a very big army, but you need an army. And you've got to equip and pay them. And for that, you need gold and silver, but we'll say gold. So how do you get gold? Well, in those days, you took it from somebody else who had it. Okay. It's not like you set up a little factory in your fiefdom and started producing things that people wanted. You took it. You became a robber baron, literally robber baron. And so you might demand tolls from merchants traveling through your lands. You might raid other lands, picking up a few captives on the way, ransom them off. You might sell privileges, sell monopolies. You want to be a barrel maker, want to be a cooper in my fiefdom. Well, you got to pay me. Maybe you sell job licensing. You want to work in my kingdom, go ahead. So a mercantilist nation is basically, it's no longer your little castle surrounded by your lands. It's now England. But you've got the same goal, right? You want political power. Well, how do you get political power? Well, you've got an army and a navy. How do you pay for your army and navy? Well, you need gold. How do you get gold? Well, you take it from people who have it. So you tax commerce. You conquer and pillage other countries. You establish colonies, and you control their trade. You sell monopoly rights. And then the big one, what we're dealing with today, is you try to ensure a, quote, favorable balance of trade. So you export more than you import. And the idea being that I export a lot of goods, I get gold, and that I don't buy goods with my gold. I pay my armies. So David Hume kind of exploded that last notion back in 1752 with his essay of the balance of trade. And what he explained was that if you keep piling up gold, prices are going to rise, right? Because you now got more money chasing the same amount of goods. And so as prices go up, your exports get less competitive, both at home and abroad, and imports start looking a whole lot more appealing. And so sooner or later, the gold's going to start flowing out, goods are going to start flowing in. So to fight that, mercantilist countries tried to clamp down on imports, and they just banned the export of gold. But that led to smuggling, corruption, paying customs officials off, and it just distorted the economy. And despite all their efforts, foreign goods kept flowing in and gold kept flowing out. So you want to talk about capitalism?
Yeah. So that's the mercantilist system, which obviously, if you're stepping back and looking at this from the outside, there's a heavy amount of government regulation involved in the mercantilist system. So compare that with capitalism then.
Okay, well, capitalism is basically what happens when you leave people free. You set up a rule of law framework. So you're going to protect people's persons and their property. You're going to allow them to contract with others, um, and kind of keep government interference to a minimum. And so people will just naturally trade goods and services uh, to their benefit. And if you just kind of back off, it works pretty well. I think the late, great Walter Williams probably put it best when he said, prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man. So there's a strong correlation between economic freedom and wealth, and believe it or not, even tolerance. Capitalist countries tend to be far more tolerant uh, than centrally planned economies. So we see women's rights in the West and not in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia. You see gay rights in the West and so on, where you don't see them elsewhere. And interestingly, capitalist countries tend to have the cleanest environments, which is something quite the opposite of what we're told all the time.
Yeah.
That capitalism pollutes the environment, and that shouldn't be surprising. Free markets reward efficiency. Inefficiency is waste, and waste is pollution.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And again, just for those of you guys that are following along at home, there is no real compatibility between mercantilism and capitalism. They're antithetical. And you talk in your article about, you already referenced David Hume, who shot holes in the theory of mercantilism, and you talked about how Adam Smith critiqued it as well. And I thought that this was one of the really interesting points that you made. Adam Smith has this critique of mercantilism, and Karl Marx Karl Marx engages with Adam Smith's ideas very heavily throughout his work. So maybe talk about the way that Adam Smith critiqued the mercantilist system. And then even more importantly than that, why, if Karl Marx understood within the work of Adam Smith that there's a difference between capitalism and mercantilism, why did Karl Marx choose to downplay that or ignore it altogether?
Sure. Well, of course, Adam Smith was a contemporary of David Hume, and they were friends. He echoed Hume's debunking of the balance of trade idea, and he argued that national wealth should be measured by productive capacity, the ability to provide goods and services, and by the well-being of the citizens rather than the accumulation of precious metals. And he argued that mercantilist policies were inefficient because they prioritized conquest and monopolization over voluntary exchange, and of course economic specialization, the division of labor. And he observed that colonies often cost more than they're worth. So it's expensive to conquer another country. It's expensive to administer it. It's expensive to keep a military force there and keep people under control. And that typically outweighs any financial gains. Now, that's not to say that individuals didn't become very wealthy under this system, but the nation as a whole was poorer for it. And so what he argued instead was free trade, arguing that it was less costly and more profitable. And that's actually proven again and again. More modern economists have noted that when colonial powers give up their colonies, that their economies actually improve because they no longer have this weight of having to support this other system. And Japan during World War II conquered a lot of area, but what they found was that they actually received less goods from those areas than they had before they conquered them, just through free trade. It turns out that people produce more when they benefit from it than when they're at the point of a bayonet. Who knew? And Germany, the same way, from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany got a lot of goods from Russia, and of course those supplies were cut off once Operation Barbarossa went into effect and he marched into Russia. Of course, Hitler had other goals in mind. He wasn't really focused on economics. But the fact is that trade is pays better than conquest does, and that's not intuitively obvious.
Yeah. So why then Karl Marx had obviously at least come across this idea before. He was familiar with this argument, but in his work, he erases the line between mercantilism and capitalism. Why would he do that?
Well, okay, again, the point of Das Kapital was to discredit capitalism, and by conflating mercantilism and capitalism, he could say, well, see, capitalism is guilty of colonialism, it's guilty of imperialism. Look at all these terrible things it's done. And sure enough, those critiques come up time and time again when people are attacking capitalism. And it's an easy attack to make because none of the countries, England and United States, totally gave up their mercantilist ideas. Um, and so those practices come back, and they lead to distortions in the economy. They lead to Trump today, he wants to go in and take over Greenland and Canada, make Canada the 51st state. It just seems intuitively obvious that if you can take over a country and pillage their village, that it's going to make you better off, and it doesn't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I really do feel like it's so ironic. I think that in the middle of the 19th century, these ideas had all kind of already been discredited, like you talked about, and it's not like Adam Smith was a fringe thinker during the late Enlightenment. Right? Everyone was familiar with the work of Adam Smith, and so could have easily cross-referenced what Karl Marx was saying about mercantilism and capitalism with Smith's critique from nearly a century before 80 years or whatever before Karl Marx was writing. But nevertheless, Karl Marx's ideas became incredibly popular in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, and since then has been in a lot of ways, or at least some of his ideas have been kind of predominant within the way that generally people in the Western world understand economic theory. So why did his ideas become so popular if they had already been to a certain degree discredited, and if someone could have looked back and say that pretty obviously he falsely equivocated or made an equivalence between capitalism and mercantilism?
They weren't popular in his own time, but I think what made them popular was the Russian Revolution. So all of a sudden, here was this Marxist revolution. And it was kind of nominally Marxist, didn't really follow the Marxist plan. But here was this Marxist revolution, and it was perceived as very successful. Now, a lot of that success came from market. So when Lenin expropriated the means of production, took over the factories, and sent all the owners off to the gulag or lined them up against the wall, production just collapsed, and so he had to usher in free market elements with this new economic policy, which was later shut down by Stalin. But Stalin invited in Western companies. And so you had Ford coming in and building one of the largest auto or truck factories in the world. Westinghouse came in, General Electric. Engineers from England came in and designed the first leg of the Moscow Underground. So when people were allowed in from the West to look at all this wonderful stuff that socialism had built, they were looking at Western technology, a lot of it. And then the West believed the numbers coming out from the Soviet Union, and it turns out they were wildly misleading. Ronald Reagan had a degree in economics, and he simply didn't believe that a centrally planned economy could be successful as the Soviets were claiming. And so he went to his head of CIA, I think it was William Casey, and he said, I just don't believe it. And so Casey went to his agents and he said, okay, we all know that the Soviet Union is this economic powerhouse, but the boss doesn't believe it. So let's pretend that it's not. And I want you to do an analysis and tell me the things that we would see if the economy was actually imploding rather than growing by leaps and bounds. And so these eggheads got together in a room somewhere, and they slid pizzas under the door, and they came up with this report that said, well, if the economy's in trouble, here's what you would see. And so then Casey took that list of things and he gave it to his agents out in the field and said, go find those things. Tell me if that's what you're seeing. And sure enough, they found it. But they had kind of had their blinders on before because their view of the world was different. Economist Russ Roberts says that there's an infinite number of data points out there, and what matters is what points you select. And so you can pick pieces of data to prove virtually anything. But your worldview helps you weed out the garbage and zero in on the good stuff, what matters. And if your worldview is flawed, if you have a bad picture of how everything works, you're going to pick out misleading pieces of data. You're going to find things that bolster that wrong worldview. And it was that paradigm shift that Reagan basically forced on the CIA that made them put on a new set of glasses and see, oh my gosh, we've been wrong all this time. The Soviet Union is not an economic powerhouse. It's an economic basket case. But meanwhile, through the 50s and 60s, as the colonial powers spun off their colonies, socialism was still kind of the reigning theory of the day. The United States was very lucky that we won our independence at a time when liberalism, classical liberalism, free markets, free people, individual responsibility, rule of law, those ideas were taking hold, and we just adopted those ideas. Well, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, they had sent students off to the London School of Economics. They came back with these socialist ideas, and those ideas helped ruin their economies. But those were the reigning ideas of the day, and I think it's important that the battle of ideas matters. And when Trump's policies fail, and they will fail, I think it matters what ideas are gaining credence at the time of that failure.
Well, that's what I want to bring this conversation back to what we're dealing with today. And I do still want to ask a couple of meta questions before we look at Trump's tariff policies in particular. But one of the things that has always fascinated me since I started studying economics 8 or 9 years ago is just I growing up, I never seriously considered any sort of economic theory, and I didn't learn about it in school. And so I just always assumed kind of the popular conception that socialism meant good and helping people, and capitalism meant being greedy and hurting people. And that was just what I assumed those two terms meant. And then one day I read an economics textbook and realized that capitalism is just a system where the government's not involved in the economy, and socialism is the exact opposite. And I was like, oh, well, that all makes sense. And it turns out I'm actually a capitalist. And so defining these terms is really important. And I think that most Americans, even ones that it's kind of like what you were saying earlier, even people that would say that they were committed socialist or Marxist don't really even know what those terms mean. But one of the great ironies is that the American left will associate all kinds of forms of government interventionism with capitalism. Why is that? Is a lot of it just like kind of this drive for political power? Is it ignorance? Is it ideology? What's the reason why so many people on the American left will attribute the consequences of government policies to capitalism?
Yeah, well, some of it I think is just, any convenient club to hand. But, unfortunately, before the ink was dry on the Constitution, people were trying to game the system. They were trying to get special privileges from the government. Um, Robert Fulton, for example, got a monopoly on steamboat operations. Uh, Fortunately, the monopoly was eventually rescinded. But there were lots of examples like that, individual isolated examples. After the Civil War, companies repeatedly tried to create lasting cartels so they could uh, fix prices, reduce competition, escape the fetters that were forged by consumers, suppliers, employees, and competing businesses. There's no such thing as unfettered capitalism, right? Um, uh, a company's fetters come from customers who can shop elsewhere, suppliers who can sell elsewhere, employees who can work elsewhere, or even start a competing business, and of course, um, other businesses who can produce better goods at cheaper prices. Um, so anyway, they tried to create these cartels. The cartels always failed because members had strong incentives to cheat by lowering prices and gain market share. So this problem was solved during the progressive era, roughly 1890 to 1920. And basically what happened was they used the government to enforce the cartel rules. So all of a sudden we got regulatory agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve Bank. And of course, all this was done in the name of protecting the public. But really what it did was it protected businesses from competition. Um, People were kind of, one of the driving impulses to that ended up in the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, was the different rates that railroads charged. So in highly competitive routes where there were lots of lines, rates were pretty low per mile, and then in lines where there was only one railroad, rates would be fairly high. And so people were angry about that. And so the ICC solved the problem by just raising the rates. And so, be careful what you wish for. You might actually get it. Well, then, FDR's New Deal extended the cartels to agriculture, automobile manufacturing, trucking, airline industries, oil and gas, coal. And that was largely done through the, National Industrial Recovery Act, I think it was in 1933. And it basically let the companies collude to set prices. Then of course, LBJ's Great Society programs extended the cartels to healthcare with Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah.
So today's progressives look at all the dysfunction and the misery that their predecessors created and say, look at how unfettered capitalism has failed.
Yeah. Is it possible to convince a large margin of the American left that the policies that they support are a result of economic systems that are more similar to mercantilism or capitalism, or have we just lost that intellectual battle with the left? I guess can we go about, like, people that have that progressive mentality? Can we go about changing their minds? What do you think about that?
Well, some people's minds can be changed, and some people's can't. Um, I forget who it was. Said something about you. It's very difficult to convince somebody that something's wrong when his salary depends on that.
Yes.
And let's face it, socialism is a path to power, and it's a path to a lot of power. Um, and it's okay. Let's say you're a politician, right? And something happens. There's a crisis. Um, well, as Rahm Emanuel said, never let a crisis go to waste, right? So a crisis is an opportunity, but but your constituents are out there demanding that you do something, right? And you don't want an economist who's going to tell you, well, let the market handle it. The market will figure it out. Millions of people all trying things, some failing, mostly failing, a few times succeeding. They'll work out something, and it'll be a whole lot better than what you can figure out. Even if you get half a dozen geniuses in a room, because millions of minds all working on a problem are going to come up with something good. But if you're a politician, you have to be seen to be doing something about this problem. And so when the global warming cropped up, a lot of politicians grabbed at whatever was available, and so now we're stuck with corn-based ethanol, for example. And even Al Gore has admitted that corn-based ethanol makes the problem worse. It results in more carbon emissions, but we can't kill it, right? Because Iowa produces a lot of corn, and they're the first primary state. Okay, so as Kevin Williams once said, once the government does something stupid, it does immortally stupid.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. It's just the incentives are such that people have a hard time really and it takes someone with an incredible amount of virtue to put their interest to the side for the sake of the common good, which I think leads perfectly into the conversation that I want to have with you about Trump's new tariff regime. There are a lot of people that have our economic views that have labeled it a form of neo-mercantilism because in a lot of ways it does bear a striking resemblance to the ideology of mercantilism. So what do you make of Trump's tariff policies? Why do you think that he's trying to implement them? What do you think he wants to get out of them? And I know that you say that they're ultimately going to fail. So maybe talk about how he's leading us down the path to economic disaster.
Well, okay. So the original mercantilists, they were trying to amass gold, right? Well, I think, we're not trying to amass gold now. I think what Trump wants is jobs, and specifically he wants manufacturing jobs. But he doesn't understand trade, and I think part of the problem is that the language is against us. The terms are against us. They hide more than they reveal. So we think in terms of America trades with Mexico. Well, America doesn't trade with Mexico. Smith trades with Chavez. And Smith, let's say, buys auto parts from Chavez and he gives Chavez dollars. Okay. So there's no debt. The deal's done. America doesn't owe Mexico anything. But there's that scary word deficit, right? That D word. Well, the deficit, whether that deal between Smith and Chavez results in a trade deficit, depends entirely on what Chavez does with his dollars. If he turns around and buys American products with them, there's no deficit. But if he just sticks his dollars under a mattress somewhere, oops, we've got a trade deficit. Or he could use them to buy goods from another country. He could use them to buy American stock, American corporate bonds, or he could build a factory in America. Now, all those things are good, right? They help Americans. They invest in the country. But they increase the trade deficit. So that's a scary thing. So Trump keeps touting the fact that all these foreign countries want to build companies or factories in the United States, but he doesn't understand that that's going to increase the trade deficit if they actually do that. Now, in my mind, there's a big question of whether they really will do that, because if you've got this unstable government now that the United States has, an unstable economy, you're thinking that, gosh, I can't get goods in that I need for my factory. Maybe it's a really bad idea to build a factory here. And it's certainly a bad idea when the tariffs that might protect you in the future are on again, off again. So you don't know what to do. You've got this regime uncertainty, as Robert Hicks put it. So there's that. So another term. So we've got this notion that America trades with China or America trades with Canada, which is simply wrong. We've got the notion of a trade deficit, which we could replace with the term foreign exchange surplus or foreign investment surplus, right? So they buy goods from us, they get American dollars, they take those dollars and build a factory here. So foreign investment surplus, that's a good
Yeah.
thing, you know. Um, so we need to try to get control of the language and start using terms that are more descriptive of what's really going on, rather than having the reality hidden between this veil of misleading words.
Yeah. Well, it's really ironic to me that for really the first time in my adult life, you have left wingers that are criticizing Trump's mercantilist tariff policy because of the economic damage that it would cause. So these left wingers are actually critiquing economic interventionism. And then these right wingers that say that they believe in limited government are all in on the Trump tariffs. And some of them think that he's playing 4D chess and this is a negotiating tactic. But I think after Trump's first 4 years, I think the 4D chess argument just doesn't, it's not empirically valid anymore. So it's just a very strange dynamic and a very strange time in American public life. And I think, how do we, so, we talked about like left wingers and trying to help them see that a lot of the negative consequences that they see are a result of policies that they support. On the flip side, how do we get right wingers to be consistently free market? Because, and this is especially true of Republican politicians, when Republican politicians are not in power and when they're on the campaign trail, they always sound like Ludwig von Mises. They're all pro free markets, and then when they actually acquire power, they're like Keynesian socialists. So how do we get the Republican base to understand, well, look, these tariffs aren't going to work, and this is just another form of economic control, and we need to be more consistent about capitalism? How do we make that case to right wing America?
Well, it's hard. The physiocrats in France, who were contemporaries of Adam Smith, believe that real production came from agriculture. Yeah. Who cares about manufacturing? That's nothing. Real wealth came from the soil. So now we've at least gotten past that mindset, but we've gotten into a new mindset that real wealth is stuff you can touch. I want to manufacture things. Real men manufacture things. And the thing is that we're producing more stuff than ever. We keep hearing about how our industrial base has been hollowed out. Our industrial capacity is at an all-time high. We're producing more stuff than ever. The value of what we produce is now something like 2.5 times greater than it was in 1970. We're producing more stuff, and we're producing more valuable stuff. So we've offshored some low value added manufacturing jobs like making textiles and making clothing, which are low wage and horribly repetitive, dull work. I've been to a legs pantyhose factory, and it took smart people. The stockings themselves, the tubes were automatically woven by fascinating machines, but they were all assembled manually. So you close the toes, attach the legs to the pantyhose, put in the panel and all that manually. And it took a lot of skill to do it. And it took even more skill to do it quickly, which is what you had to do. But then once you had mastered it, it was just deadly dull, sitting there hour after hour, day after day. A person intelligent enough to master those skills would go stir crazy in a month. So they're jobs that Americans don't want. And in fact, there have been hundreds of thousands of jobs openings in the manufacturing sector for years that they just can't fill because Americans don't want the jobs. So we're going to build more factories and staff them with who? But so the other thing is that we've got to get people past the idea that only material things represent wealth. One of the non-intuitive lessons I learned being a computer jockey, systems analyst, was that in manipulating symbols, you gain a lot of leverage over physical things. You gain power over physical objects. And that's not obvious, but it is true. So I can sit at a milling machine and, carve out a piece of equipment or a part, one after another, or I can go and program a CNC machine, and that program is there to make piece after piece after piece. And so instead of me sitting there making thousands of pieces by hand, the machine does it for me. And all I had to do is program that thing once. So that's power. That's a lot of power. Um, one of the myths is that, oh my gosh, when we become a service economy, we'll just be flipping hamburgers. Well, that ship sailed a long time ago. I think the date that keeps coming up is 1956, is when the number of service jobs exceeded the number of jobs in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors combined. So we've been a service economy for a very long time. And, some of those jobs are not very well paying. I don't think being a barista at Starbucks pays all that well, but doctors, lawyers, engineers, health workers. Um, the I think the number of people in manufacturing peaked at 19,000 back in 1979. Depending on whose numbers you look at, we already have more healthcare workers in this country than that. Houston, Texas, where I live, the oil capital of the world. Our number one industry today is healthcare. The Houston Medical Center is the largest in the world. So, things are changing. Um, uh, just where I live, I see factories on trucks come into the community every day. You've got mobile bicycle repair, mobile car repair, mobile auto detailing, pet grooming. Um, uh, the list is endless. It's just amazing what what clever people have come up with. And Marx always claimed that capitalism was evil because it kept the means of production out of the hands of the workers. Well, the means of production have never been more available and more affordable. So, obviously there's the laptop and the cell phone. 3D printers, label makers, automatic embroidery machines, podcast equipment, um, drones, for aerial photography and surveying. Um, the list is endless, and people of very modest means can afford those. There are 33 million small businesses in this country. It's amazing. The entrepreneurship in this country is just amazing. And the idea that greedy capitalists are all hoarding their wealth and denying people livings or the means of production is just wrong. Um, a lot of people don't want to own their own business. I don't know how many small businessmen I've talked to who said, I never worked so hard in my life as when I started working for myself. Well, not everybody wants to do that, and that's okay. But what's so strange is that medium income is way up. Um, People are having to work fewer and fewer hours to afford um, not just the basics of life, but luxuries. And yet we've convinced ourselves that we live in the worst of times and things are getting worse. And so we're going to burn it all down and hope that something better arises from the ashes. And that's just crazy.
Yeah.
But how do you convince people? I don't know. I write my little articles. I'm working on a basic economics book, which is fun, high school level. It's called Caveman Econ,
Oh, yeah.
Basic Economics and 33 Prehistoric Tales. And so each chapter is a story about my little caveman community. And then there's an analysis section that explains the lesson. And then there's a back to the future section that puts the lesson in today's world. And then I've got occasionally a soapbox where I opine. And then I've got my, questions for discussions and stuff. And it's a fun book. So hopefully it'll sway somebody. But that's a problem though. We've taken economics out of schools and we've replaced it with, 2-minute hate sessions,
Right.
struggle sessions.
Yeah. So, and I do think that is, I kind of want to end, I guess, on two final questions here that are both related to this. So the average American is not going to be reading Mises.org, or Zero Hedge. They're, and probably not even like Reason Magazine, right? So
Yeah.
publications, and organizations that promote these free market ideas are really kind of, I guess, niche communities that tend to attract people that already agree with our ideals. And I know that you said that, and I think this is completely correct, that when the tariffs fail, people are going to be looking for someone or something to blame. And I think you and I both know that unfortunately it's going to probably be capitalism on the left, even though we know that that's not what's driving this. So how do we go about? Is it just we have to try to build relationships and make the case with people in our lives? What's the best way to just try to convince our friends and family, the people that we're in communication with every day? What's the best way to try to convince them that free markets are actually good? And I guess, to top that off, do you think we actually have a shot at making a real positive difference in the future? Like, is there a possibility for reform in this country?
Oh, sure. Anything's possible. I would say, don't get into heated discussions. Keep it very, very simple. But to do that, to reduce complex ideas down into very simple thoughts takes a lot of effort. One of the memes I came up with is socialism says that it's going to redistribute wealth from each according to his ability to each according to his need. But that creates incentives for people to demonstrate minimum ability and maximum need. And, the biggest pushback I've gotten on that online is, the laughing emoji, right? Nobody's come back and said, oh, you're wrong. People don't respond to incentives. People do respond to incentives, and people get that at a real basic level. And, capitalism rewards people for producing wealth, food, clothing, shelter. And so more wealth is produced. You get what you provide incentives for. You get what you reward. You get less of what you penalize. Well, if you penalize production and reward consumption, that's a good recipe for poverty. And people get that. But I think one of the problems, though, is, as Milton Friedman put it, the problem with capitalism is capitalists.
Right.
The problem with socialism is socialism. So, you can point to crony capitalism and it's bad. It's out there. But really that's socialism light, right? Yeah. It's government involvement in the economy. And another thing that people kind of get is that when government gets in the business of selling special privileges, guess who can best afford to buy? Well, it's the wealthy. And when you look at the United States, most of the wealth transfer isn't from the rich to the poor, it's from the poor to the rich. So the two biggest offenders, of course, are Social Security and Medicare. So we're moving wealth from relatively poor workers, young workers, to the elderly, who are the richest demographic in the country. Now, sure, there are poor elderly, but you shouldn't have to subsidize Bill Gates to help out a poor old person.
Yeah. No, I think that makes perfect sense. Well, Richard Fulmer, I've really enjoyed talking with you today. I think that the article is great. I'm going to put a link to this in the show note. I highly recommend that everyone go and read it and then really think seriously about how these economic concepts work and then what it means for how we interpret Trump's new policies and just kind of engage with these economic ideas in society in general. Before I let you go today, just tell us, where can people find your work and some of the other articles that you've written?
Oh, gosh. I post on Substack. You can just Google my name, Richard Fulmer, and I'm all over the internet.
All right. Perfect. Well, Richard Fulmer, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.